Hi, everyone. Harry here with some new details and pretty bad ones for DOJ that have emerged from the hearing yesterday before Judge Curry on the motions by Tish James and James Comey to dismiss indictments because Lindsey Halligan's appointment, on which the whole indictments depend, was in fact flawed and lawless. We talked about it a lot yesterday. This has to do with the whole scheme that Congress has put in place to be sure their role is protected. The Senate's role is protected in consenting or giving a contribution and advice to the appointment of U.S. attorneys who are inferior officers under the Constitution. As one of the lawyers said yesterday, if you were to greenlight what they did here, then there'd be no need ever to go through confirmation proceedings again. You could always do this. The department tried to say, oh, it's just a mere paperwork error. This was really something that could easily be repaired. That itself is a very dubious proposition. It's basically saying the whole statutory scheme isn't real. It's just ministerial. There's really no way of framing it that way. But what I want to talk about today is their second backup argument, which is Pam Bondi looked this whole thing over, and several weeks later, she issued a proclamation that said, hereby, it's on stationery and everything, I hereby appoint Halligan as a special attorney to conduct legal proceedings in the Eastern District of Virginia, and I ratify what she's already done. Point number one that the lawyers were very quick to make is, look, if you're relying on this, it's an implicit concession that the actual indictment with her signature on it, then might as well be the signature Daffy Duck for its actual representation of a real U.S. attorney. That signature, if that's what you're relying on, you're basically conceding that what happened before was flawed. Again, let's leave that to the side, and because what Bondi says is, I have the authority to designate and appoint Lindsey Halligan as the U.S. attorney. Probably not, but to avoid any doubt, I'm going to now appoint her to this additional position of special attorney, and so ratify what she's done, give her authority, and then here's the big paragraph, last paragraph. In addition, based on my review of the grand jury proceedings in United States versus Comey and James, that's the very ones that are in question here, I hereby exercise the authority vested in the Attorney General by law to ratify Ms. Halligan's actions before the grand jury and her signature on the indictment. And I do this, she makes clear, after having reviewed all the legal proceedings, including the grand jury proceedings that occurred. So the entire argument is premised on her statement based on my review of the grand jury proceedings. And that led to a real black eye in court, because it turns out that Judge Curry said, give me what happened in the grand jury. I want to be able to evaluate her role. And of course, we knew then Halligan's never stepped inside a federal prosecutor's office, much less a grand jury. And it was a big case where she was wanting to loyally bring, metaphorically, the heads of Comey and James on a plate to Donald Trump. So who knows what she did in that grand jury. But the Judge Curry says, give me all the information, all the transcripts. And they do, except not what Halligan actually said. And Judge Curry said, are you kidding me? I said, give me everything. And they did, except for there's a big chunk missing. Let me just start and tell you, as a former prosecutor, ain't no such thing. I have never, ever heard of any kind of proceeding, legal proceeding that might matter, grand jury, trial, evidence, motions hearing, anything that isn't transcribed by a court reporter. If there's a hearing going on and the court reporter misses something, everything stops to repeat. If the court reporter has to use the restroom, everything stops. If the court reporter has to change paper, everything stops. In other words, this is an absolute fundamental requirement. And in case there's any doubt, Rule 6, which governs the grand jury, says expressly that all the proceedings will be transcribed. Now, it's true that then the prosecutor, if ordered to produce transcripts, directs you talk to the court reporter who has, piles and piles of potential material that he or she could transcribe, and you say, I need this, this, and that. Sometimes that won't include what the prosecutor said in the grand jury, which tends to be boilerplate. But here, Pam Bondi says, I reviewed what she did, and based on that, I hereby ratify everything and appoint her. And so a absolute, colossal embarrassment that in court, Curry was a little bit cryptic about just what happened, but there's a missing chunk of Halligan's performance that Curry needs in order to evaluate. But more importantly, Bondi says her action is based on her review of the grand jury proceedings, and it's not. It's just not based on the full review. No idea what happened during this gap. Which has been characterized, in different lengths. It sort of doesn't matter. Something bad could have happened there, and Pam Bondi wouldn't know it, and Judge Curry wouldn't know it. So, as a legal matter, this, it seems to me, really serves up an argument or a holding by the judge, who has said she will rule on the whole motion by Thanksgiving, to really dispense with this second proffered reason, this so-called ratification, which I think is not legally effective anyway. The question is, as the attorney for James told the court, was she authorized at the time? But in any event, it seemed from the hearing, and we talked about this yesterday, that Curry was likely to go with the motions, as has every other court that's considered a comparable maneuver by the Trump administration. They've said, no, this is not a real U.S. attorney, and it's not a real indictment. You then get to remedy, and we've talked about this as well. James is not saying dismiss the indictment. She understands somebody else, with Halligan being entirely walled off, could maybe do it. Comey, whole different story. The statute of limitations has run. And I think if the judge rules that Halligan, that the indictment was ineffective because Halligan wasn't a duly appointed U.S. attorney, I don't see how they put the eggs back together again. That's the legal point. But there's the broader political point, personal point for the whole amateur hour and Keystone Cop operation and complete politicized kind of reprisal machine that is the current Department of Justice. Bondi comes in and says, I've reviewed the record, and based on that, I think everything is on the up and up. And guess what? There's no basis for saying that. So if this department and this attorney general are capable of embarrassment, that's a question in some doubt. I think an opinion that really drives this home would be, humiliating for any professional. But in any event, Halligan and the Department of Justice have totally given James and Comey a club to beat them with. And just as an aside, what the hell happened here exactly? Because as I say, you never, ever conduct proceedings without a court reporter. Is it barely possible that, Halligan's the only one there and the court reporter says, I feel like going home. Is that okay? And Halligan says, sure. The actual underlying facts are going to be an additional source of embarrassment if they come out. Probably the DOJ tries to hide them, but that may require them to kind of throw in the towel on this motion because it depends, at least in part, on their ratification argument that kind of crumbles to nothing once it's clear that Bondi didn't review, as she said in her proclamation, the grand jury proceedings, at least not all of the pertinent ones, because there's just a big chunk missing. Curry may know the actual details and didn't want to make a big deal of it in court, or maybe not, but I think we'll see it figuring in her decision that we'll get by Thanksgiving. And just in general, I'm here to tell you, it's an absolute elementary blunder that something like this happened, if indeed it really is missing. Just total amateur hour. Talk to you later. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video and other Talking Feds content, please take a second to like and subscribe. Talk to you later.